They had exactly 9 minutes of heat left. They just did not know it yet. The needle on the gas gauge hovered above, empty like a cruel joke. The storm outside the Vermont forest was swallowing entire roads without a trace, and when the headlights dimmed for a split second, Elise grabbed Nolan's arm and whispered the one thing neither of them was ready to hear. "If this car stops, we won't be found." Because out there the snow was not just falling, it was moving sideways, rising, burying, erasing, and somewhere in that white chaos, the last tire tracks of their station wagon were already gone. January 18th, 1971, Windsor County, Vermont. On an unplowed forest road 5 miles off Route 103. The storm warnings had mentioned heavy snowfall and wind gusts over 40 miles per hour. Nothing unusual for midwinter in Vermont. Nothing that sounded like a trap. And Nolan believed they could cross the forest stretch before dusk. But within minutes, the sky pressed lower, and the snow stopped falling downward and began moving sideways, sweeping across the windshield in hard white sheets, the trees dissolving into shadows, the road narrowing to guesswork between 2 fading ruts. And when the station wagon lurched slightly under his hands, he felt it before he understood it, the sense that the world behind them was already disappearing. The rear tires slipped once, corrected, then slid again with more force, the steering wheel light and unreliable. Elise falling silent as the engine note shifted into a strained hum. Not loud, just thinner. Snow packing under the chassis, the headlights reflecting back into their eyes as if they were driving inside a tunnel of moving chalk. And then the car drifted sideways and dropped with a muted thud that tilted them toward the passenger door, groceries sliding, Elise's shoulder striking the window, and when Nolan pressed the accelerator, the wheels spun freely, spraying powder that hit the undercarriage with a hollow rush, the vehicle no longer moving forward, but digging itself deeper. They both stared at the gas gauge without speaking, the needle hovering just above empty, the heater still pushing out fragile warmth, the wind rocking the car in steady blows that felt deliberate, snow already climbing the lower edge of the doors, and Nolan tried reversing gently, then more firmly, the engine coughing before settling into a rough idle. And that small hesitation tightened something in his chest, because it was not dramatic failure that frightened him. It was gradual weakening, the idea that the car would simply grow tired before they did. He shut the engine off to listen, and the silence inside the station wagon was immense, broken only by wind forcing itself through the trees and the ticking of cooling metal, Elise's breath turning visible in the dimming light. And when she whispered that they could walk back to the highway, he opened the door an inch, and the cold struck instantly, sharp and absolute. Visibility no more than 20 feet. Snow stinging his face in that brief exposure. The forest reduced to shifting white and dark shapes, and he understood that stepping away would mean losing sight of the only fixed object in the world. When he turned the key again, the engine hesitated before catching, the headlights flickering once, long enough for both of them to notice, and in that fragile pulse of light, they recognized the simple arithmetic ahead. Fuel measured in minutes, warmth rationed in strict intervals, the storm not easing but strengthening as evening approached, snow rising along the glass, the station wagon settling lower into the drift. And Nolan made the decision quietly. They would run the engine 10 minutes out of every half hour and wait for morning, not knowing that morning would reveal no road, no tracks, and no sign that anyone had passed within miles. Night did not fall all at once. It pressed inward slowly, draining the last gray light from the windshield until the forest became a single moving shadow, and Nolan kept his eyes on the faint outline of snow piling against the glass, as if watching it would slow the accumulation, the engine running in careful intervals. 10 minutes of heat, 20 minutes of silence, each restart a quiet negotiation with fate. And Elise counted the cycles under her breath, not because it helped, but because numbers were steadier than fear. Outside, the wind strengthened with the darkness, striking the station wagon in long, forceful gusts that made the frame shudder, snow scraping along the metal like dry sand. During one of the silent intervals, the cold advanced quickly, creeping from the floorboards upward, settling into their boots first, then their knees. Elise wrapped her scarf tighter and pressed her hands between her thighs for warmth. And Nolan noticed frost beginning to lace the inside corners of the windshield, delicate patterns forming despite their breath, a warning that the thin barrier between them and the storm was losing ground. He suggested they clear the exhaust pipe before the next engine cycle. The snow could already be blocking it, and the idea of stepping outside again tightened Elise's jaw. But she nodded because the alternative was worse. He opened the door carefully and the wind tore it from his grip, cold striking his face with violent clarity, snow immediately filling the gap at his feet. He stepped out into drifts already knee-high, the car's shape distorted by accumulation, the rear nearly swallowed, and he moved toward the back with slow, deliberate steps, brushing snow away with his gloved hands until he found the exhaust pipe buried and packed tight, his fingers numbing within seconds, breath sharp and thin in his lungs, and he cleared it methodically, knowing that if he rushed he would lose balance, and if he fell he might not see the car again in the swirling white. When he climbed back inside, the warmth from the previous cycle had already faded. Elise pulled the door shut hard, and for a moment neither of them spoke. His face reddened from exposure, snow clinging to his coat and melting into damp patches that would soon turn cold. She started the next engine cycle and listened closely to the ignition. The hesitation slightly longer this time, the headlights dimming before stabilizing, and Nolan watched the fuel gauge drop almost imperceptibly, but enough to confirm what he already understood. The margin was narrowing faster than they had planned. The wind intensified near midnight, gusts rocking the station wagon with enough force to shift its angle deeper into the drift. Snow now halfway up the doors, pressing against the glass in thick waves, and during one silent interval, a heavy thud struck the roof, a branch or packed ice falling from above, making Elise gasp and grab his arm. The forest reminding them it was not passive. Nolan calculated again, 5 miles to the highway. Impossible in this darkness, impossible in this wind, and yet staying meant trusting a machine that was steadily losing strength. So they agreed without fully saying it, that if the engine failed before dawn, they would have to choose between freezing slowly inside or stepping into the white void. And the knowledge of that decision waiting ahead made the darkness feel even closer. The wind shifted sometime after 2 in the morning, not easing but turning sharper, striking the buried side of the station wagon with a steady force that made the frame tremble against the packed snow. And Nolan felt the tilt increase by slow degrees, enough that he braced one boot against the floor to steady himself. The headlights glowing faintly during the last engine cycle, and revealing nothing beyond a white wall inches from the glass. Snow now level with the lower edge of the windows, the forest completely erased, and when the engine cut off again, the darkness felt absolute, as if the storm had closed a lid over them. The next restart was worse, the key turning with a dry click, the engine coughing once, failing, then catching on the second attempt with a strained vibration that ran through the steering column into Nolan's hands, Elise holding her breath until the heater fan began to spin, thin warmth pushing out with less conviction than before, and both of them staring at the fuel gauge without speaking, the needle now resting deep in the red. Not empty yet, but close enough that every minute of idling felt like burning something irreplaceable. Nolan stretching the intervals to 40 minutes of silence, gambling against the cold, trying to outthink a storm that did not care about calculations. During the longer shutdown, the temperature inside the car dropped fast, frost spreading across the windshield in branching patterns that crept inward despite their breathing. Elise rubbing her arms hard, her movements growing slower, and Nolan forced her to talk, to describe their apartment back in town, the cracked kitchen tile, the narrow hallway, anything ordinary that kept her mind engaged, because he had begun to notice the way her eyelids lingered closed a second too long, exhaustion mixing with cold in a dangerous way. And when she suggested again that they should try walking at first light, he did not dismiss it outright this time. He only asked how they would find the road when even the trees were hidden. A sharp crack split the night without warning, followed by a heavy impact that struck the rear quarter of the car and jolted them forward in their seats. Snow cascading down the back window in thick waves, Elise gasping as the roof flexed under the sudden weight. Nolan twisting to look through the narrow, clear patch he had scraped earlier and seeing nothing but swirling darkness, understanding that a branch or small tree had broken under the strain of ice and wind, and the realization settled heavily between them. The storm was not just burying the car. It was actively changing the landscape around them, making each hour less stable than the last. When the engine shut off again, the silence felt different, deeper. The snow now pressing firmly against both doors, the car encased up to the windows, and Nolan imagined trying to open a door at dawn only to find it sealed shut, forcing them to climb out through a window into drifts taller than Elise. And for the first time he considered that waiting might trap them completely, that survival might require movement before they were ready. Yet stepping outside in darkness meant risking immediate disorientation. So he made a decision he did not share fully at first light. No matter the wind, he would climb out and assess the burial, because the idea of doing nothing any longer felt more dangerous than the storm itself. Dawn did not arrive with light. It arrived with a dull whitening of the darkness, a faint shift that revealed how completely the station wagon had been consumed. Snow pressed solid against the windows, sealing the doors in a pale wall, and Nolan understood at once that opening them would be impossible. The handles frozen, the seams packed tight, so he wiped a small circle clear on the passenger window and measured the depth with his eyes. The drift nearly level with the roofline, the forest still invisible beyond the moving veil of wind. And Elise watched him without speaking, reading the conclusion in his posture before he said it. They would have to climb out through the side window. The first attempt to lower the glass failed, the crank stiff with cold, and Nolan worked it slowly, forcing it down inch by inch until a narrow opening admitted a blade of freezing air, snow immediately spilling inside in loose handfuls, Elise turning her face away as he pushed his shoulders through the gap, the roof only inches above the drift, his gloves sinking into packed powder as he hauled himself upward, the wind stronger than he expected, cutting across the roof and stealing his breath. And for a moment he flattened himself against the metal, eyes shut, steadying the panic that threatened to tilt him sideways into the white void. From the roof, he could finally see the shape of their burial. The station wagon nearly swallowed to the windows on both sides, the rear almost level with the drift, the road indistinguishable from the surrounding forest, trees bent under heavy snow, branches fractured and hanging at sharp angles, no tire tracks visible in any direction, no sign that a plow had passed within miles, and he felt a sharp, unwelcome clarity. Even if the storm eased, no one would drive this way soon. The shortcut too narrow, too easily ignored in favor of larger highways, and that realization pressed heavier than the wind against his back. He dropped down beside the car and began digging at the driver's door with gloved hands, clearing space in deliberate motions, carving a shallow trench so they could at least open it if needed, each movement slow and exhausting in the knee-deep snow. Elise calling to him through the cracked window to conserve strength, but he ignored her for several minutes, driven by the need to create options, because options meant control. And when he finally climbed back through the window, his coat was dusted white and his breathing uneven, the cold already seeping through damp fabric. Inside again, the air felt thinner, colder than before, their fuel now dangerously low, the gauge hovering at the edge of empty, and Nolan explained what he had seen without dramatics. No visible road, no fresh tracks, no movement in the forest, only miles of buried silence. Elise absorbed the words quietly, then asked the question he had been avoiding. How long before the gas runs out completely? And he did not answer right away, because the truth was no longer measured in hours but in cycles, and the next time the engine failed to start, they would not have another barrier between themselves and the deepening cold. By late morning, the storm eased just enough to reveal shapes instead of shadows, the wind dropping from a roar to a steady push, and Nolan decided they could not afford another full engine cycle, the gauge resting flat against empty. The last restart weaker than the one before, so they shut it off completely and sat in the thin daylight without heat, listening to the silence settle around the buried car. Elise's fingers pale despite constant movement. Nolan forcing himself to think clearly, because waiting without fuel was no longer strategy. It was surrender, and surrender would let the cold move in unchecked. They rationed their remaining food with mechanical precision, half a can of soup eaten cold, shared in slow spoonfuls, each swallow deliberate, the thermos offering only a final mouthful of lukewarm coffee that tasted like something from another life. And Nolan suggested they build insulation inside the car, packing loose snow against the interior panels where the metal was exposed, using spare clothing to block drafts along the doors. Elise working without complaint, anger replaced by focus, both of them understanding that small actions were now the only currency they possessed, and every minute of movement kept their blood circulating, kept sleep at bay. When the afternoon light began to fade again, Nolan returned to the roof through the side window, this time with a clearer plan. He scanned the forest for any break in the trees that might suggest the road's direction, searching for the faint line of fence posts he remembered passing earlier, and after several long minutes he spotted a subtle indentation in the snow extending northeast, not obvious but slightly flatter than the surrounding drifts, a possibility rather than proof, and he committed it to memory before climbing down, his decision forming even before his boots touched the roof. Inside, Elise saw the change in his expression immediately, and when he described the faint line, she did not argue, though fear tightened her voice, because staying meant freezing slowly in a sealed shell, while moving meant risking disorientation in deep snow. And they weighed the options in silence, calculating distance, 5 miles at most to the highway if they followed the right direction, far longer if they strayed. The temperature still well below freezing, the wind not gone but manageable, and Nolan finally said what neither wanted to admit. If they waited another night without fuel, they might not wake fully. They prepared with care, layering every piece of clothing they had, tying scarves across their faces, marking the car's antenna with a strip torn from Elise's sleeve so it might stand out against the white if they circled back. And as Nolan pushed the window open once more, the cold flooded in with immediate force, the forest stretching silent and immense around them, the station wagon half buried behind, and for a brief second Elise looked back at it as though leaving a house rather than a car, knowing that once they stepped away, the storm would begin erasing even this last marker of where they had been. The first step away from the station wagon felt unreal, as if the world beyond it were unfinished. Nolan lowering himself into snow that reached above his knees, Elise following carefully, the wind no longer violent but steady enough to steal warmth through every seam in their clothing. And when Nolan turned to look back, the car already seemed smaller, half consumed by white, the strip of fabric on the antenna snapping weakly in the breeze, their last fixed point in a landscape that offered no edges, no clear direction, only trees bending under weight, and a pale sky pressing down. They moved northeast, following the faint indentation Nolan had seen from the roof, each step deliberate, lifting boots high and planting them firmly to avoid twisting an ankle beneath hidden obstacles. Elise walking directly in his tracks to conserve energy. The snow uneven, sometimes compacted by wind, sometimes collapsing to mid-thigh depth without warning, their breathing loud inside scarves. The forest silent except for the muted hiss of drifting snow. And after only a few hundred yards, Nolan felt the first doubt creep in, the indentation fading where drifts had shifted overnight, the line no longer certain but guessed. When Elise stumbled against a buried branch and fell forward into the powder, panic flared between them, not because she was hurt, but because she vanished from sight for a second too long. Nolan dropping to his knees to pull her upright, snow filling the gap where she had been as if eager to close it, and she laughed once, too sharply, the sound brittle with fear, insisting she was fine, but her glove was wet now, and wet meant danger. So they stopped long enough to replace it with Nolan's spare. their movements clumsy from cold, fingers stiffening despite effort, time slipping faster than they had intended. They pressed on, counting steps in groups of 100 before pausing, Nolan scanning the trees for any break that suggested a wider corridor, the hope of a plowed highway beyond the forest. Yet every direction looked the same. Trunks spaced irregularly, branches bowed low, and when he tried to glance back to gauge their distance, the station wagon was gone, swallowed entirely by terrain and drifting snow, and the realization struck harder than the wind. They had committed fully now. There would be no easy return to shelter, only forward movement into uncertainty. As afternoon light began to flatten again toward gray, Elise's pace slowed despite her refusal to admit it, her steps shorter, her breathing uneven. Nolan calculating the remaining distance with no landmarks to confirm it, and when a sharper gust rose suddenly from the west, lifting loose snow into swirling curtains that blurred even the nearest trees, he understood how fragile their orientation truly was. One wrong angle in this growing white haze, and they could circle without knowing. So he forced them to stop behind a thicker cluster of trunks. Both of them bent forward, hearts racing, realizing that the forest was beginning to close around them once more. They waited behind the cluster of trees until the gust passed. Both of them bent forward with hands braced on their thighs, snow lifting in thin spirals across the forest floor, and Nolan forced himself to choose a direction before hesitation hardened into fear. He aligned himself with the thickest row of trunks ahead, reasoning that a road would have cleared a wider path through the forest years ago, even if buried now, and Elise nodded without arguing, trusting his logic because there was nothing else left to trust. And they stepped out again, slower this time, guarding each movement as if the snow itself were unstable ground. The terrain began to slope downward almost imperceptibly, their steps lengthening with gravity's pull, and Nolan felt a cautious flicker of hope. Roads often followed lower grades through forest, avoiding steep ridges, yet the descent also deepened the drifts, wind funneling through the dip and piling snow higher between the trees. Elise struggling to lift her legs free with each step, her breath louder now, uneven, and Nolan shortened their intervals, pausing every 50 steps instead of 100, forcing her to drink the last of the melted snow they carried in a small plastic bottle tucked inside his coat. Midway down the slope, Nolan heard something new, faint but distinct beneath the wind, a low mechanical hum that did not belong to trees or air, and both of them froze, listening hard, the sound coming and going in uneven waves, too distant to locate precisely, Elise whispering that it could be a plow, and the word itself ignited urgency. They angled toward the direction they thought it came from, pushing through denser branches, snow cascading from above as they brushed against bowed limbs, the hum fading again until it was uncertain whether they had imagined it at all. As they reached the bottom of the slope, the ground leveled abruptly, and Nolan's boot struck something solid beneath the snow. Not wood, not rock, but a flat resistance that felt deliberate. He dropped to one knee and scraped away powder with gloved hands until a narrow strip of frozen gravel emerged, darker and firmer than the surrounding drifts. Elise crouching beside him, eyes wide, and for the first time since leaving the car, they saw evidence of human design beneath the storm. Not yet salvation, not yet a plowed highway, but a roadbed hidden under layers of snow. They stood in the center of that buried road, uncertain which direction led outward, the faint hum no longer audible, the forest pressing close on both sides, and Nolan chose left based on instinct rather than certainty. The slope they had descended suggesting the highway might lie beyond, Elise adjusting her scarf and following without protest, and as they began walking along the unseen gravel path, wind rising again in the distance, both of them understood that finding a road was only the beginning, because a road without traffic was still only a line through the cold. They followed the buried road with renewed urgency, boots striking firmer ground beneath the snow, the surface uneven but unmistakably shaped by tires long before the storm, and Nolan kept them walking at a steady pace, not too fast to exhaust themselves, not too slow to let cold settle in. Elise's shoulder brushing his each time the wind gusted sideways, the forest thinning slightly along the corridor, trees spaced farther apart as if respecting the invisible line of gravel beneath their feet. And for a moment, the simple fact of direction felt like relief. The hum returned without warning, louder this time yet still distant. A low grinding vibration carried unevenly through the air, both of them stopping in unison, heads tilted, Elise gripping his sleeve as if sound itself might vanish if they moved, and Nolan strained to isolate it, the noise rising and falling, sometimes swallowed by wind, sometimes clearer, metallic and rhythmic, unmistakably mechanical, and hope flared sharply, dangerous in its intensity, because if it was a plow, then it meant proximity to a maintained highway. But if it was only wind funneling through trees, their strength would have been spent chasing an illusion. They quickened their pace despite fatigue, following the road's faint curve, the snow shallower in places where wind had scoured it down to the hardened surface, and Nolan began scanning for signs of recent disturbance, broken crust, compressed patches that suggested passage, and then he saw it. A shallow trough cutting across the drift ahead, not fresh enough to gleam, but distinct from untouched snow. Elise dropping to her knees to brush it clear, revealing the faint imprint of a tire edge, narrow but deliberate, and both of them felt the same surge of disbelief. Someone had been here, perhaps hours ago, perhaps less. The wind rose again, blowing fine powder across the track and threatening to erase it even as they looked at it, and Nolan urged them forward along its direction, boots slipping on compacted patches, Elise breathing harder now but refusing to slow. The forest opening gradually to their left, trees thinning into a wider clearing that hinted at something larger beyond, and the hum grew stronger, no longer imagined, vibrating faintly through the ground beneath their feet, a sound that belonged to heavy machinery fighting through resistance. They reached the edge of the clearing just as a new gust swept across it, snow lifting in veils that blurred the horizon, and Nolan climbed a small rise at the road's side, squinting through the white, and there, faint but undeniable, he saw a darker line cutting across the landscape beyond the trees, wider than the forest road, straighter, and as the wind shifted, he caught a flash of dull metal moving slowly along it. Elise stepping beside him, eyes searching the same direction, both of them frozen between relief and fear, because even if that was a plow, it was still far enough away that they would have to cross open ground to reach it. The clearing offered no shelter, only exposure, wind sweeping across the open ground in long, unbroken currents that lifted snow into shifting curtains, and Nolan understood immediately that crossing it would drain what little strength they had left. Yet the darker line beyond the trees was unmistakable now. A highway cut through the storm, and the slow metallic movement along it confirmed what they had hoped. A plow pushing through accumulation, steady but distant. Elise gripping his arm and asking how far, and he judged the distance in silence, perhaps a quarter-mile across uneven drifts that hid ditches and frozen ruts beneath their surface. They descended from the small rise and stepped into the open, snow deeper here, wind stronger without the barrier of trunks, each stride requiring effort that burned through their legs, Elise leaning slightly forward to counter the gusts, Nolan angling them diagonally to avoid walking directly against the wind, the plow's engine noise rising and falling as it advanced along the highway, sometimes clearer, sometimes nearly swallowed by distance, and fear returned with urgency, because the vehicle was moving, not waiting, and if it passed beyond their reach, they would have no second chance before nightfall. Halfway across the clearing, Elise stumbled hard, her foot plunging into a hidden depression, her body pitching sideways into the drift. Nolan dropping instantly to pull her upright, snow filling the hollow again as if eager to erase the mistake, her breathing sharp with shock, and for a second he considered turning back toward the forest road, conserving what little energy remained. But the sight of the moving plow through the haze hardened his resolve. He forced her to stand, checking quickly for injury, finding none beyond strain, and they resumed, slower but unbroken. The wind intensified suddenly, a strong lateral gust that reduced visibility to a few yards, snow lifting in dense spirals that blurred the highway line ahead, the plow's silhouette vanishing entirely, and panic rose fast and bright in Elise's eyes. She shouted that they had lost it, that they were walking blind again, and Nolan fought the urge to spin in place, instead focusing on maintaining a straight trajectory, recalling the angle from the rise, counting steps, refusing to drift left or right despite the force pushing against them, because losing direction now would mean wandering in open ground with no cover. Then, through the thinning veil of snow, the dark edge of asphalt reappeared closer than before, a wide strip partially cleared, banks of pushed snow lining its sides, and the sound of the plow grew unmistakable, heavy and grinding just beyond a shallow curve in the highway. Elise let out a strained breath that was almost a sob, but Nolan did not allow relief to settle. Not yet, because the machine was still moving away from them, and unless they reached the road in time and made themselves visible against the white, it would continue forward, unaware that two figures were fighting the wind behind it. Nolan did not wait for the wind to clear. He stepped onto the edge of the highway and climbed the packed snowbank, waving both arms high above his head, shouting into the roar of the plow's engine, Elise beside him, her scarf torn loose and lifted like a flag. The machine already rounding the shallow curve ahead, its metal blade throwing snow in heavy arcs, and for one crushing second it continued forward without slowing. The driver sealed inside his cab, visibility limited. The two figures behind him no more than shifting shapes in white. Elise stumbled onto the asphalt itself, boots sliding on the partially cleared surface, and Nolan grabbed her before she fell into the path of the blade's return. Then he ran several steps down the shoulder, cutting closer to the machine's line of sight, waving harder, screaming until his throat burned, and finally the plow's brake lights flared red against the gray afternoon, the massive vehicle slowing with deliberate resistance, blade lifting slightly as it came to a grinding stop 20 yards ahead, the engine still rumbling like distant thunder. For a moment neither of them moved, fear and relief colliding in equal force, until the cab door opened and a bundled figure stepped down, the driver scanning the white landscape in disbelief, as if unsure whether the shapes he had seen were real. Nolan raising one hand weakly now, no longer waving but signaling surrender to the cold. Elise's shoulders trembling uncontrollably as the adrenaline drained from her limbs, and when the driver shouted over the engine, asking where they had come from, Nolan could only gesture vaguely toward the forest, unable to form a clear answer. The warmth inside the plow's cab felt almost unreal, a heavy mechanical heat that pressed against their frozen skin and made their fingers ache as circulation returned. Elise's eyes closing briefly, not from exhaustion, but from the shock of safety. Nolan forcing himself to remain upright and coherent, answering the driver's questions in fragments, explaining the shortcut, the buried car, the night without fuel, and the driver shook his head slowly, saying the smaller forest roads would not be cleared for days, that the main highway itself had only reopened that morning after relentless effort, and if they had waited one more night in the drifts, the outcome would have been different. As the plow turned back toward town with them inside, the forest receding behind its reinforced windshield, Nolan watched the clearing shrink into white and understood how narrow their margin had been. Not heroic, not dramatic, only a series of decisions measured in minutes and steps. The choice to leave the car before it sealed completely, the angle taken across the clearing, the refusal to stop moving when the wind erased the plow from sight, and he felt no triumph. Only a quiet respect for the cold that had nearly claimed them. Because survival had not come from strength alone. It had come from refusing to let stillness become surrender. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.